I now call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 40 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Fisheries and Oceans. This meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to House Order of June 23rd, 2022. Before we proceed, I would like to make a few comments for the benefit of witnesses and members alike. Please wait until I recognise you by name before speaking. For those participating by video conference, click on the microphone icon to activate your mic, and please mute yourself when you are not speaking. Interpretation for those on Zoom, you have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either Floor, English or French. For those in the room, you can use the earpiece and select the desired channel. Please address all comments to the Chair. Finally, a reminder that screenshots or taking photos of your screen is not permitted. The proceedings will be made available via the House of Commons website. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted on September 20th, 2022, the committee is commencing its study of the closure of the mackerel fishery in Atlantic Canada and the Gulf of St. Lawrence. I would also like to advise all members that all sound checks have been done for all the witnesses and have been working fine. I would now like to welcome our first panel of witnesses. Representing the Ecology Action Centre, we have Sebastian Pardo, Sustainable Fisheries Coordinator. Representing Oceans North, we are joined by Katie Slate, Senior Fisheries Advisor. And appearing as an individual, we have Dominique Robert, Professor and Canada Research Chair in Fisheries Ecology, Institut des Sciences de la Mer, Université de Québec à Rimouski. We'll now go to opening remarks for 5 minutes or less. Mr. Pardo, we'll go to you first.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Hello, bonjour. Je vous remercie pour l'occasion.
I thank you for giving me this opportunity to make a presentation. This is a very important issue because we've thought about how to address the fall in mackerel fishing, and at the same time, how to ensure these stocks for the future.
Science, and now work with the Ecology Action Centre, which is one of Atlantic Canada's oldest and largest environmental organizations, founded in 1971. We advocate for sustainable and resilient fisheries that support thriving coastal communities. As part of this work, we are members of the Atlantic Mackerel Advisory Committee and have been part of the Mackerel Rebuilding Working Group since its inception. Today, I would like to focus on three main reasons why the closure of the mackerel fishery was the right decision and why it should remain closed until there are robust signs of rebuilding. First, the best available science shows that a moratorium was the only option left to rebuild the population. Mackerel have been in the critical zone for most of the past decade. Even though a rebuilding plan was finished in 2020, none of its objectives have been met, as management decisions to reduce catches prior to the moratorium have failed to encourage population growth. Furthermore, the abundance of reproductive age fish in 2021 was the lowest ever recorded, and the largest and oldest fish that produce higher number of eggs have almost disappeared from the population. All these indicators are evidence of the dire state of the mackerel stock, and that the fishery closure enacted this year is the best option to encourage rebuilding. On top of this, the Fisheries Act states that for species in the critical zone, like mackerel, conservation considerations must prevail, and this closure brings management of this fishery in line with the precautionary approach, which is a cornerstone of Canada's sustainable fisheries framework. Second, more mackerel being seen in some regions does not mean the population is recovering. This phenomenon could be explained by other reasons other than increases in mackerel numbers. One explanation could be that due to behavior well documented among many fishes, with cod being the best example. When fish number decline, some species start to school more frequently, creating the appearance of higher numbers. Another explanation is that marine species in the North Atlantic are already expanding north due to warming waters. And for example, mackerel historically observed on the Scotian Shelf could now be seen further north in eastern Newfoundland. Preliminary research done by Fisheries and Oceans, which was presented in the last advisory committee meeting, suggests that mackerel in eastern Newfoundland, one of the regions where they're being perceived to be in higher numbers, do not belong to a separate breeding population as some have proposed. Saying all this, we would welcome more resources being directed for further studies to help elucidate these unknowns. Last, and most importantly, Rebuilding the fishery is the only long-term option for fishers who depend on mackerel, and they must be supported while the population rebuilds. Thousands of people across Atlantic Canada and Quebec are already undergoing financial hardship because of the closure, and indeed face severe uncertainty as it is difficult to predict when the fishery will reopen. Unfortunately, past management decisions that have reduced catches year after year without resulting in population growth have slowly brought this hardship upon fishing communities. Rebuilding the mackerel population to a healthy level can support a thriving fishery with much higher catches than those seen over the past decade. We could have more fishers and processors making a living, and also a bait source that is more readily available. In contrast, reopening the fishery before rebuilding would allow for limited short-term catches, but risks further depleting the population, a scenario that would prolong hardship to fishing communities. In the meantime, it is absolutely crucial to ensure that the people directly affected, particularly small-scale fishers and plank workers who are impacted the most, have support to manage financially through these closures. It is also crucial that the coastal communities are not further impacted by lack of opportunities and that they can be ready to fish when these stocks are healthy again. To repeat those three reasons why the mackerel fishery should remain closed in the short term until there are robust signs of rebuilding. 1. The best available science shows that a moratorium was the only option left to rebuild the population. 2. More mackerel being seen in some regions does not necessarily mean the population is recovering. And 3. Rebuilding the fishery is the best long-term option for fishers who depend on mackerel, who must be supported while the population rebuilds. In simple terms, this issue boils down to a question of values. Do we value short-term economic relief at the risk of a permanent stock collapse and long-term financial hardship, or do we value the long-term sustainability of this fishery and the future of fishing communities? Thank you very much for your time, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you. We'll now go to Ms. Sleet for 5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me to participate today. I'm joining from Mi'kma'ki, and I'm here representing Oceans North, a Canadian charity that supports marine conservation and sustainable fisheries in partnership with coastal and Indigenous communities. I started working on mackerel in 2014 when the TAC was set at 10 times more than DFO's scientific advice, and the stock was already critically depleted. Since that time, I have been engaged in mackerel science and management alongside DFO, industry, and Indigenous groups in an effort to see this stock recover. Atlantic mackerel have been critically depleted for more than a decade now, and the spawning stock biomass, or the estimate of stock abundance, is at the lowest level ever recorded. Also, while mackerel can live up to 20 years, we rarely see fish more than 5 years old now. This is a common feature of overfishing. Over many years, the fish that are caught get smaller and smaller. Fewer fish are also surviving long enough to reproduce. Fisheries rebuilding is now legally required under the Fisheries Act, and mackerel are among the priority species, a move that was supported by all parties. A rebuilding plan for mackerel was released in 2020 after several years of collaboration and sincere effort from industry to recommend measures and take action to rebuild the stock. Unfortunately, a year later, we failed to achieve the lowest objective, seeing positive growth in the stock. Oceans North is of the strong view that the minister's decision to close the commercial and bait fisheries for Atlantic mackerel in 2022 was evidence-based, difficult, but ultimately necessary. We understand that the 2022 closure had immediate financial consequences from the industry. But while the short-term financial pain is real, it could lead to long-term gains. The benefit of a rebuilt stock is often overlooked in the economic analysis of fisheries quota reductions. In 2020, Oceans North released a cost-benefit analysis conducted by Gardner Penfold Consulting on the economic benefit of rebuilding mackerel. It revealed that minimizing fishing could lead to benefits estimated at over $54 million. That's a 12.9% return on the investment of rebuilding the stock to healthier levels. A rebuilt stock can benefit everyone and the ecosystem. The reliance on the critically depleted mackerel stock as bait for many in the lobster industry has been a topic of discussion between industry and DFO, ENGOs, and the Marine Stewardship Council since at least 2015. One study estimates that up to 2 pounds of bait could be used for every pound of lobster caught. The problem isn't mackerel per se, it's the sheer volume of raw fish used. Luckily, several companies and research institutions have been working on alternative bait products over the last several years. And one study has found that an alternative bait fished just as well as traditional bait, but had the added benefit of lasting longer. We applaud the researchers and companies trialing baits that use less fish and the harvesters who are experimenting with these products. This needs to continue through increased investment in trials. We often hear that the science isn't taking fishermen's views into account. However, industry is present for and contributes meaningfully to DFO's peer-reviewed assessments. DFO also established an industry science working group for mackerel in 2020 to address gaps in science needs and observations. There were also many Indigenous colleagues around the rebuilding table who strongly believed in the science and supported rebuilding actions. And it's not just DFO that's reporting similar declines. The United States, with whom we share this population, has been seeing similar negative trends. In 2020, the U.S. enacted an emergency action to drastically reduce their quota after their rebuilding plan also failed. The two countries need to continue to work together to rebuild the stock. Here at home, surveys of recreational fishers have found they've also noticed declines in fish abundance and size over time, corresponding to the scientific assessments. The closure of the mackerel fishery was based on strong scientific evidence, fisheries observations, and DFO law and policy. Previous efforts to rebuild the stock through management measures and quota declines have failed. Closing the fishery was necessary to rebuild the stock for the future of both the industry and the ecosystem. Thank you for your time.
You will now go to Mr. Robillard for 5 minutes.
Nous passons maintenant à M. Robillard pour 5 minutes.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Chair. Very briefly, I'm a professor and Canada Research Chair in commercial fishing at the University of Quebec, Rimouski. In 2008, my doctoral thesis dealt with the environment for the larval stages of mackerel in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, with particular emphasis on the environmental factors that affected the survival of the larvae and which are responsible for rebuilding the adult stock. And following that, I've often worked on this species and participated in fisheries and oceans evaluations. I am therefore qualified to comment on the environment for this species in regard to management of it. Unlike other feedstocks in Canada, the evaluation of mackerel is based on a reliable counting of how many adults there are in the spawning area in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Since mackerel can change and migrate based on temperature, it is essential to verify from time to time if much of the spawning is taking place elsewhere than in the zone covered by the study. In recent years, the study of the number of fish has occurred in other zones, like the west coast of Newfoundland, the Nova Scotia Plateau. But the importance of spawning outside of the Gulf has always been considered very small for calculating abundance. And the critical situation now is based on two different main causes: the high mortality for adults and low survival rate for larvae. For mortality of adults, we believe that despite the severe reduction in commercial catches over the 20 past years, quota passing from 75 to 4,000 tons, the mortality from fishing is still too high. In addition, there is natural predation by tuna, bluefin tuna in the Gulf, and there is also some indication that other predators like the gray seals, which is much more present than in the 1960s, is very negative for the mackerel in the South Gulf. So predation has greatly increased since 2000. And finally, recent studies have studied the origin of mackerel taken in U.S. winter fishing. and a significant proportion of those captures come from the Gulf of St. Lawrence stock. So this is another source of mortality that we have difficulty calculating. And in addition to the high mortality for adults, the lack of stock can be explained by the decrease in recruitment since 2010. This reduction is based on recruitment and because of unfavorable environmental conditions. In the first weeks of life, larvae must find enough food in order to survive, but they cannot. With the rapid warming of the South Gulf of St. Lawrence, their development period for the main prey of mackerel has changed. They now develop earlier in the season, whereas the mackerel spawn at the same time. That means that there is a spatial and temporal disconnect between the emergence of the larvae and the production of their prey, which has increased or decreased recruitment. And the rate for establishing stocks depends on a return to colder conditions. But this does not seem to be what climate projections foresee. A few recommendations. First of all, we have to reduce as much as possible fishing activity until we see signs that the adult stock is rebuilding, and creating a strategy to better measure mortality caused by fishing, including fishing, bait fishing in areas where it's not compulsory to declare catches, as well as winter fishing in the United States, and work to create a management plan in a cooperation with the United States, since the St. Lawrence mackerel are often found in the winter fishing catch, and use other alternative baits from fish such as the redfish until these stocks are reestablished. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Right on the mark. We'll now go to our rounds of questioning, and first we'll go to Mr. Small for 6 minutes or less, please. You're on mute.
Again? Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the witnesses for taking time out of your busy schedules to help us out on this very important study. My first question to Ms. Schleit. In making your recommendations in the mackerel assessment this year, which stakeholders were you representing?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So Oceans North is a Canadian charity, as I mentioned. So we do work closely with harvesters and Indigenous communities. We don't represent fishermen. We are an environmental charity. But as I mentioned in my statement, we work alongside fishermen. I've been at the table with harvesters since at least 2015, talking about the difficult issue of the mackerel declines and trying to come up with solutions.
All right. I just wanted to clarify your stakeholder attachment here. So I've got this question. So if there are no mackerel bycatch in cod nets happening and few recreational catches and little or no visual encounters of mackerel, what would you say your first take would be on the state of the mackerel stock?
I'm sorry, so if you're saying if you can't find any mackerel, what would be the assessment of the state of the stock?
What would you say? There's no mackerel, some mackerel, plenty of mackerel. How would you describe it if there was no indication of any mackerel anywhere?
Well, we base our decisions on consultation with DFO as well as harvesters, and so over the last decade, we've been involved in the science process alongside industry, and during those discussions and assessments, which have taken into account many indicators of mackerel health, including egg surveys, including information from the fisheries such as size, length, catches, those have all indicated decline over the last 10 years.
Thank you.
So that's what I'm basing my information on.
I'm aware of that, and what I'm not aware of is any changes that science has made in their stock assessments due to shifts in ocean temperatures. And I know we've got leatherback turtles, far north is Labrador, sharks moving into our northern waters. Species are adapting and moving. But has DFO changed its approach in how it carries out its surveys at all, to your knowledge?
Yeah, so our organization has been advocating for DFO to take climate change into account, so we definitely agree on that fact. And that's a question that's been put to DFO a lot over the last several years in terms of whether or not they need to change the timing of the egg survey. And from extensive analysis that they've done, my understanding is that the egg survey is timed more specifically to day length at the moment, and that the range of temperatures in the Gulf are still suitable. However, as Dr. Robert noted, we are seeing environmental changes that are impacting the stock.
Okay. So there's been numerous accounts of mackerel from the Bay of Fundy up to Pictou County to the south north shore of Quebec, south coast, Newfoundland, west coast, east coast, northeast coast, as far north as Grosswater Bay. And everyone that's been on the water this year has caught mackerel. They're all saying that mackerel is more plentiful than they've ever seen it in their entire life. Are you saying that these people are all wrong?
No, not at all. I think that fishermen's observations and accounts are very important, and that's why, again, we've sat at the table with them, specifically working on rebuilding plan objectives, specifically working on different management measures that we could take into account to rebuild the stock.
My time's really brief here. How much have you invested, your organization, how much have you invested in mackerel science in the last 10 years?
In mackerel science, well, we invest in a lot of science throughout the country. In particular, we're looking
Could you explain Ocean North's science program as it pertains to mackerel in Atlantic Canada?
As it relates to mackerel in Atlantic Canada, I would say at the moment we've invested a lot in the impacts on climate change in Atlantic Canadian fisheries.
Could we put a dollar value on your investment? Could we put a dollar value on that?
I'm not sure that that's relevant, but you're happy to look through our financial records.
Mm-hmm.
But we've invested and put out publications that you can read online. Everything's available to the public on the impacts of climate change on fisheries. We've also invested on the impacts of how seabirds are perhaps used as indicators of forage fish status. That's another way that we can take into information from the ecosystem, and all that information is available to you.
Are you familiar with the diets of mackerel? When a mackerel swims, when it swims, it's eating cod larvae, lobster larvae, capelin larvae, herring larvae, you name it, all these species that remain in Atlantic waters throughout the year, long after mackerel have migrated to the region. With the abundance of mackerel, which we can't quantify, I guess, what do you think the impact of a bloom in the mackerel stock will be on the rest of the species in Atlantic Canada, if that bloom is as big as we think it is?
Well, of course, we have to take into account current information in terms of assessing the current status of mackerel. So I'm looking forward to seeing the most recent results from DFO as well as the stakeholder observations. But again, I'm basing my testimony on a decade's worth of evidence from multiple sources that indicates a severe decline in mackerel. And we do expect to still see fish in the water. In fact, we want to see fish in the water. That's part of rebuilding.
Mr. Chair,
thank you, Mr. Small. You're going a little bit over. We'll now go on to Mr. Morrissey for 6 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Chair. And we've just heard from three witnesses and who basically all arrived at the same conclusion, that the mackerel stocks are in significant distress on the East Coast, I'll use. But again, Mr. Small's comments were comments that I hear from fishers as well. So my first question would be, and it would be to Mr. Pardo, could you explain briefly the conflict between what the fishers are seeing and reporting and the scientific information that all three of the witnesses pretty well arrived at the same conclusion, which is that the closure is the only option to rebuild the stock. Mr. Pardo, could you a short answer, because I have a host of questions.
Yes, thank you for the question. So there are many reasons for why there's this discrepancy. One is the spatial area. So yes, more mackerel might be being seen in certain parts of Newfoundland, but we're not taking into account what's happening in the rest of the region. I've also anecdotally heard that in Western Newfoundland, in the Gros Morne area, people are not finding mackerel there. So it can be mackerel distribution can be patchy, and the stock assessment is truly the only way we have to assess the population as a whole. Another discrepancy is what it's called hyperstability, but basically it's what happened with cod, that as abundance drops of a fish, they start schooling more. So they start appearing in certain areas. So you see them, they're more abundant in that specific area, but it's not an accurate representation of the whole stock. And also climate change. We know already fish are moving further north, so mackerel at the northern end of the distribution we're seeing more mackerel at the northern end and fewer mackerel at the southern end.
Thank you, Mr. Perdo. In your opening comment, you indicate that everybody wants to see a sustainable stock because it's only through sustainable stocks that we will build viable coastal communities. Then you went on to make a comment, which I would like you to expand on, that the management plans were never achieved over the past number of years. That concerns me as a East Coast parliamentarian, that management plans were never achieved. Could you expand on that?
I said the rebuilding plan objectives weren't achieved. Is that what you referred to?
Okay, yes.
So over the last decade, the management actions have not caused population growth. In fact, over the last decade, the management decisions have led to further population declines. And because of that, the rebuilding plan was created, and the rebuilding plan objective was basically to encourage population growth, and that objective has not been achieved because we're at the stage of the assessment from last year that the mackerel are at the lowest spawner abundance ever recorded. So that's what I meant.
Could all three of you just comment a short answer? Are you comfortable with the best data that's been provided on this resource, which primarily comes from the Department of Fisheries and Oceans and related? Are you comfortable with the data that you are observing? Starting with you, Mr. Pardo.
Thank you. Yes, I think fishery science is an extremely complex science, and the models and the approach that DFO has is robust, so I'm comfortable with it.
Shall I go? Yes, we're also comfortable with this science. Our role isn't always to just take everything that DFO does, as truth. Obviously, we play a critical role in terms of DFO as well. With regards to this science, we've been watching it for a number of years. And as I mentioned, it's very robust. It's based on a lot of different scientific evidence that's been confirmed year over year, and also confirmed by US scientists as well. And some of the science that we have now has actually adapted based on some of the recommendations of industry. For example, we've added in more natural mortality estimates to account for those observations from fishermen. So yes, we are confident in the science. Thank you.
Michelle, you said industry advised you to adapt your the reporting? To take mortality?
Sorry, not me, but at the last DFO assessment, which we participate as, we're participants at the science advisory table, like industry and indigenous groups. And one of the changes that was made, yes, was a change in terms of the natural mortality take into account some of the observations that harvesters are seeing. Unfortunately, it's not changing the outcome. Thanks.
Okay. Dr. Robert, would you comment? And then I want you to also comment. I only have a minute left. You made reference to reduce fishing as much as possible, and that the bait fishery in particular was the most unregulated of the mackerel fishery. Would you comment?
Yes, I can comment on that. So given that the biomass is depleted, and because the I think the data that are provided by DFO on abundance are robust. So mackerel is one of the very few pelagic stocks that are managed with robust data in Canada. So I'd like to highlight that. The fishing pressure needs to be reduced. The commercial fishing has been well managed and well controlled, but bait fishery not in all parts of the Atlantic Canada. So, but the reduction of fishing right now should apply to all types of fishery, including recreational fishery.
Thank you, Mr. Morrissey. We'll now go on to Madame Debienne for 6 minutes or less.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you to our witnesses. Always very interesting. Thank you for being with us. Mr. Robert, you said earlier that you have you referred to analysis of the resources, the stock of mackerel since, and you've been doing this since 2010. And some of your statistics probably come from Quebec fishermen who are required to keep these records. And how can you explain then that some groups of fishermen are required to take and keep records and others are not? That's a very good question. First of all, I'd like to clarify that the work I've done on mackerel are with regard to the environment for the larvae, and that's the references with regard to fish supply are based on statistics from Fisheries and Oceans, and then with regard to the record keeping and the requirements to report. This is something, a management issue required by Fisheries and Oceans that I'm not really qualified to reply to. Yes, but this requirement to measure, to keep records, this is something that is required. Well, with different types of fishing, it's important to know what effect fishing has on mortality. And so we, when we evaluate a stock of fish, what quantity was fished, we have to know how much the catch was, and we have to have reliable statistics, and there's also recreational fishing and other factories, and also the winter fishing in the United States, and the fishing in the St. Lawrence. That's part of our stock and calculations. So you suggest that there should be contact and cooperation between the U.S. and Canada. So since 2010, you've been studying this fish, and how can you explain that the mackerel fishers have only learned about the closing of the fishing season only barely 48 hours ahead of time? How can you explain that? Well, there's no specific explanation. I can just say that for a while now, the scientific consensus was that there should be a significant reduction in quotas, and this is for 10 years now. There's been this consensus which has been building, and the decision to close the season was the good one. How it was done or announced, that's another story. But I can't really have any comment to make on it. I understand you're a scientist, but it's just that we wonder about this lack of notice, and what hope do you think there is to rebuild this stock? How long will it take? Years? Decades? That's a question that's just difficult to answer, because We need a good cohort like we had in 1989. If we have a significant recruitment and if the young survive in great numbers, then they will be able to reach an age where they in 4 or 5 years the situation will be much better. And for example, in 2022, the young fish, if they survived when they were young, then it would still take 4 or 5 years before that would have a great deal of effect. And I think that for the time being, we haven't seen any positive signs of a recruitment for the future. Could we say that there would have to be a real effort to change, to fight climate change, to change water temperatures and improve resources? Yes, an action plan for fighting climate change is also always a good thing. But with mackerel, we have to understand that there are variations from year to year in the environmental conditions. I mean, we have climate warming, but there are also years where it's much colder, and so there's this affects the relationship between larvae and their prey, and we have to allow the reproductive stocks to stay in their milieu and to allow for continued spawning and growth of the stocks. So the important.
On the mark. Thank you for that. We'll now go to Ms. Barron for 6 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. I just want to acknowledge my appreciation for us being here today and how we have an opportunity for open dialogue for us to hear from those who have concerns around the commercial use of mackerel and its environmental impacts, but also to hear about the concerns of commercial fishers and the long-term sustainability of their industry. I think it's important that we're not pitting one against the other and instead talking about what the facts are here and how we move together to have a more sustainable fisheries and oceans. I appreciated, Ms. Schliet, your comments around the economic benefits of rebuilding mackerel and how those rebuilding efforts actually benefit us all in many ways, including economic, as you quoted some of those numbers there, and the actual return rate of that investment. So I think these are important things for us to consider. I'm wondering if you could share a little bit more, Ms. Schliet, on the working groups that you were talking about that included industry, Indigenous colleagues, and what was the extent of those meetings that have been happening over the years?
Yeah, thanks. So I mentioned, I believe it was 2015 that DFO first established a rebuilding plan working group, and that met, I believe it was at least 4 times a year. And then there's also the advisory committee meetings, which meet normally once a year. And then there's also biannual stock assessments. And all of these meetings have participation from DFO Science, a lot of industry members, a few NGO members, some Indigenous community members. I know DFO also held special meetings with Indigenous communities ahead of advisory committee meetings to further hear and share views. And, this was not a difficult time. These tables were large. As I said, we started in person several times a year and then moved to virtual. And there was a sincere effort from all around the table to work on solutions together. So things like, could we change the net sizes? Could we change some of the seasons? Could we, there are a lot of solutions brought to the table that were further investigated by scientists and et cetera. But unfortunately, the outcomes that we always, or the answers, or where we always ended up based on the science advice and thorough scientific analysis, was that a reduction in the TAC was what was going to rebuild the stock.
Thank you. My next question is for Dr. Pardo. Dr. Pardo, thanks so much for outlining some of your thoughts for us on the reasons why we're seeing higher numbers, and some of your suggested potential reasons why we're seeing increases in certain areas, and sort of broke that down for us. I think it's always interesting to hear the different perspectives on that. I'm wondering if you can share with us what you feel would be robust signs of rebuilding of the mackerel.
Thank you for your question. And before I go into it, I'd like to clarify that the explanations I gave are potential. My point is that we don't know. These things could be happening. We don't know. But it links to what would be a robust sign of rebuilding. And what we really need to see is the outcome of a stock assessment that shows that the abundance of spawning fish above the critical zone. So above a certain threshold that's been established by the advisory committee, that would be a sign of rebuilding.
Thank you for continue. Thank you for clarifying the points that I was trying to clarify. Go ahead.
Yeah. So without the stock assessment, all we have is we have a lot of evidence from people in the water, and it's very useful and optimistic. But the stock assessment is truly the best tool we have to assess the overall abundance of mackerel in Atlantic Canada and Quebec.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Perhaps I can ask both yourself, Dr. Pardo, and Ms. Sleep, perhaps yourself first, but sort of a two-part question, but what would you expect to happen to the stock if it didn't shut down, and what would it look like to you if when there were signs of a reopening of the mackerel fishery?
So it's hard to say what would happen in the future in a hypothetical scenario, but what we've been seeing over the last years is that if we kept fishing at even these very low rates, we kept seeing the stock declining further and further. So I would imagine, and it's not far-fetched to imagine, that if we were to reopen the fishery too early, we would see either the population that's not recovering or it's getting even lower. So that's what I would perhaps expect to see, but you never know. And what was your second question? Second part of the question?
Yeah, what would you expect to happen if the stock didn't shut down, and what would it look like? What would it look like to you when the fisheries are ready to reopen? The mackerel fisheries are ready to reopen.
We would see much more mackerel everywhere when the fishery is ready to reopen. If it's rebuilt to the point where it's above the critical zone, it's a place it hasn't been over the last decade. So the mackerel people would be seeing in the water would be, what they would be at a levels all around the region higher than they'd seen in a long time. So that's what it would look like. It would be, I would say, bountiful.
Pardo. Ms. Sleet, did you have any comments on the questions that I was asking?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think similar to Dr. Pardo, we were seeing these signs for years that the stock was going to continue to decline at current harvest levels. And that is what we saw year after year until finally the latest science showed that it was at the lowest level ever recorded, very few larger fish and also very little recruitment, which is necessary. There was a blip in 2015 where we had what's called a larger year class, but that was essentially fished out within a few years due to the high TAC levels. So, I guess we'd expect to see many indicators showing signs of decline if we were looking at a healthier stock. Thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Barron. We'll now go to Mr. Perkins for 5 minutes or less.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, witnesses. My questions are primarily for Dr. Robert. Dr. Robert, you participate in the annual spawning mass bioscience studies that are done by DFOs on mackerel, is that correct?
Yes, not on all of them, but I'm usually a participant, yes.
The last time it was done?
The last time it was done, I was there online, yeah.
But that was last year in 2021?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. The water temperature needs to be between 10 to 13 degrees. Is that correct for mackerel to spawn?
Yeah, I think we say at least 7 degrees and at the maximum about 14 degrees. That's about the max range. And I think the values that you gave are probably like peak optimal temperature, perhaps, yes.
That's the peak time. So in the last 10 years, the average temperature that DFO has gone out from the study and work that my team have done is about 8 degrees. And sometimes going out as early as early June, June 6th, when the water is even colder than that. So if you're sampling spawning biomass when the water is much colder, and as I understand, DFO goes to the same spot in the Gulf every year when they do it, slightly different days. But if you're going too early, what's the result of the study?
So exactly. Timing is important. So the reason why the survey goes on from mid-June to late June, it's about a 2-week survey, is that this is the time when, on average, most of the spawners are in the southern Gulf of St. Lawrence. In some years, either because of an anomaly with the survey, for example, the vessel was not able to get there on time because of a breakdown or something like that, the survey is not considered in the time series as an abundance survey, so they are discarded. The way that we are able to correct for the interannual differences in the timing is by sampling the females all over the Gulf with the help of harvesters and also the scientific samplers of DFO. And so those samplers are able to know through the season how many or what's the proportion of females that have spawned and that have not spawned yet. So that ratio plus the...
Sorry, I appreciate it, just short on time. And we've had testimony already today that the migration patterns are changing because of climate change and water change, yet DFO goes to the same spot every time. It is possible that they are spawning in different areas than where DFO is searching, correct?
Yeah, exactly. So,
okay.
So we know that the mackerel...
Go ahead, sorry.
So we know that the mackerel is migrating following temperature streams, as you mentioned. So they are following the 7-degree isotherm when they migrate into eastern Canada. And
have found spawning,
in the summer,
fishermen have found spawning size mackerel now. If you want to, I don't know if you can see the screen. My colleague Clifford Small is holding it up.
Yes.
Notre Dame Bay in the northeast of Newfoundland in August.
Yeah.
So when you're going out in June and going out early in June into the Gulf, you're actually missing large parts of the spawning biomass, or I believe DFO is. Is that possible?
Well, actually, there's always a possibility, but so far, and actually, I've been a part of a sampling team to try to catch larvae in that part of Newfoundland a few years ago, and we were not able to catch large numbers of larvae or eggs. So there is spawning. We measure regularly spawning outside of the southern Gulf of St. Lawrence, but
able to find
so far,
them
always negligible amounts.
Fishers have been able to find them quite easily in northeast Newfoundland. One last question. In mortality, what's the proportion in mortality of those taken by gray seals versus fishing?
We don't know that. Unfortunately, there has not been a formal study on natural mortality by mackerel. There is on herring in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, but not on mackerel, and that is a point that we could raise here. It's that data is needed.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Perkins. We'll now go to Mr. Cormier for 5 minutes or less to close out this portion.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you very much, Chair. And I have many of the questions that have already been asked, but I'd like to ask Mr. Robert. You talk about, I think that you have undertaken some studies and the statistics that you have used to reach the conclusion that you have, and as well as things you've done with Fisheries Oceans and with other groups. Have there been differences? No, it's the key here is to measure supply, and it's not individual researchers. It's basically Fisheries and Oceans undertaking these studies. I look at the statistics, and there are academics and also governmental analysts, and this is how we come to our decisions. And according to you, was it a right decision to have a moratorium to close the fishing? Yes, yes. The supply is too low to be able to sustain the rebuilding of the stock. If we look at the fishing or for herring, for example, in spring herring fishing, and if I now think about fall fishing for herring, do you think it's the same situation as in the spring? No, the stock is better in fall than in spring, and when you compare the two, generally that is the trend in the Northwest Atlantic. And why, according to you, is the fall herring stock better than in spring? It's about the same problem as for mackerel. And, the figures show that the weight of the young fish were better, and it's the fall stocks that are healthier. And if we come back to mackerel, and there's something that was very interesting that came up earlier, and with regard to mackerel, the supply seems that we have the same stock that's being fished. We have closure in mackerel fishing here in Canada, but the same stock comes and goes towards the United States. And are we not, therefore, saying it's going to be extremely difficult to have improvement in mackerel stocks if in the United States they can keep fishing mackerel and we can't? What do you see? Well, the mackerel in the Gulf and in summer they go back to the U.S. waters for winter, and there is winter fishing in the United States, and even their stocks have dropped, as we've heard, but it's still open, I believe, in the United States in winter, and that's a big problem because that requires us to consult and coordinate with the U.S. to ensure that these stocks are rebuilt, because otherwise we won't be able to rebuild the stocks, especially if the U.S. continues to fish. And very quickly, when fishermen say to us that there's lots of mackerel, there's lots of herring, and it's true, but as you've said, it's the size. Often they're too small to have become mature. Is that the problem? Well, there are two things. The fish, even if there are not a lot of fish compared to the past, we come to a point where there's they're going to disappear, and then the big mackerel we see very few now. And that's a problem, of course, for reproduction. And this is a sign that the situation is bad.
Time is up, exactly. So we're going to finish off this session now, this first hour. I want to say thank you to all three witnesses, Mr. Perlow, Mr. Robert and Ms. Sleet, for sharing their knowledge with us here today. We'll suspend now for a couple of moments just to switch out panels and get started on our second hour. Witnesses, please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. For those participating by video conference, click on the microphone icon to activate your mic, and please mute yourself when you're not speaking. Interpretation for those on Zoom, you have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either Floor, English or French. For those in the room, you can use the earpiece and select the desired channel. A reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. I would now like to, of course, welcome our witnesses. Representing the FFAW, Fish, Food and Allied Workers Unifor, we have Mr. Keith Sullivan, President, of course, on Zoom. Representing the Regroupement des Pêcheurs Pélagiques Professionnels du Sud de la Gaspé, we have Ghislaine Collin, President, and Laurette Lelive, Commercial Fisherman. And representing Inverness Southern Fishermen's Association, we are joined by Mr. Jordan McDougall, Commercial Fisherman. Thank you for taking the time to appear today. You will each have up to 5 minutes for an opening statement, and I will invite Mr. Sullivan to start us off for 5 minutes or less, please.
Okay, thank you. Hope you're hearing me well. So on behalf of our 13,000 members, Newfoundland and Labrador, thank you for the opportunity today. It's an important topic. The Fish, Food and Allied Workers Union represent inshore fish harvesters in our province. That's 3,000 enterprise owners, probably 7,000 crew members. Also have those who work in fish processing. So mackerel are a primary pelagic species harvested in Newfoundland and Labrador. It is an important commercial species with historically very extensive landings. And as it is a transboundary stock with the United States, FFAW has lobbied for over half a decade with other industry members on the issue of the changing migration patterns, poor overall coverage of the science survey, changing fishing patterns, to look into science more substantially. So on March 30th, 2022, DFO announced a moratorium on the commercial mackerel fishing in Newfoundland and Labrador, despite what harvesters see as very positive signs of growth in this stock. Harvesters did not expect this closure, especially without a commitment to increasing stock assessment surveys. For years, harvesters have suggested that DFO science is significantly underestimating the biomass of mackerel and proposed science projects that would demonstrate what they have observed at sea, but no recommendations to work collaboratively to address this incomplete science have really been pursued. Mismanagement of the stock has been an ongoing issue for fish harvesters in this province for years. DFO science does not have sufficient data on substantial recreational fisheries, which remain open while commercial fisheries closed, nor are the impacts of removals of the northern contingent or Canadian mackerel in U.S. waters. While the American catch was reduced in the past year, they've had a commercial fishery this year, recreational fishery for mackerel carried on, and people were thrown out of work who depend on the resource. FFAW has repeatedly called on DFO science to revise its approach to mackerel science so the true understanding of the size and migration of the stock can be understood. Unfortunately, the experience and knowledge of harvesters have been dismissed over a decade, and as a direct result, our industry has faced significant financial loss. The closure of the mackerel fishery this year was met with widespread disappointment as harvesters had experienced increases in catch levels compared to the previous years. Since 2016, stakeholders have stated that the science is underestimating the biomass, and valuable observations from harvesters continue to be ignored in decisions. These observations indicate that mackerel are spawning in areas that are further east than current surveys we know are in the southern Gulf right now. Expanding knowledge of Atlantic mackerel spawning behavior is critical. The current DFO approach to assessing the size of mackerel stocks involves a survey in the southern Gulf, far from other areas where people are observing signs of growth in the mackerel resource. Mackerel harvesters have seen quite an abundance despite the declines in stock assessments. Questions regarding additional mackerel spawning sites outside the southern Gulf have been repeatedly raised. Not only have harvesters seen an abundance of mackerel during the timing of the mackerel fishery, but harvesters in the southern area of Newfoundland and Labrador have seen them on the St. Pierre Bank as well. FFAW proposed science that will include improved sampling and data from the province, including collection over an extended time from all regions. We've had adult mackerel collected from 3PS in June and July in 2021 by longtime fish harvester Keith Bath. Mr. Bath reported that the adult mackerel were increasingly more common in the bank area in July, whereas in previous years they were getting mackerel in their nets in May. And finally, harvesters all around the province, whether it's the northeast coast or the southwest coast, in Fortune Bay, reported seeing these very small mackerel in stomachs even while hunting birds, for example. Taken together, these observations suggest that mackerel are distributed in Newfoundland and Labrador waters throughout their life cycle. At the advisory meeting last year, FFAW representatives presented ample evidence of a strong Atlantic mackerel stock and called on DFO Science to revise its approach to mackerel science so that a true understanding of the size and migration of the stock can be understood. The department advised of a commercial closure in 2022. Our interest and commitment to mackerel research goes beyond sample collection. FFAW has applied for funding to do otolite microchemistry research with DFO Science and academic researchers to determine maturity. We've also done our own studies this year with fishermen, FFAW, fishermen paying to do their own work because the department wouldn't commission it. So our recommendation is that DFO immediately invest in expanding their mackerel science and consult with harvesters in developing this work.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Sullivan. We'll now go to Mr. McDougall for 5 minutes or less, please.
Good day. Can you hear me? Yeah, I'm a commercial fisherman in Inverness South Fishermen's Association, and I fish off the western coast of Cape Breton, and I fish lobster, tuna, mackerel, crab. But about 15 years ago, we had a large body of fish that would come through here, and the fishers could make a partial living from this resource. And now that body of fish is no longer here. What we're finding with the biomass here, it's small, and the fishermen can't seem to get a large fish anymore, even for tuna fishing during the summer and the fall, compared to 15 years ago. And we weren't surprised to see the quote something happen with the mackerel. But we don't know if the big body of fish has moved north, if there is a bigger body, and if it's because of water temperature, and our water is getting warmer here. But we have a large body of small mackerel here, so the future looks good. Would like to see more science, of course, with the mackerel, and then the problem we worry about when they have a total closure like this is the reopening. And when that will happen, and what will happen, and how the resources will be divided up then. But that's our main concerns here. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll now go, I believe, to a joint statement by Mr. Collin and Mr. Lalive. 5 minutes or less, please.
Hello, Chair, members of the committee. I represent 23 members, professional commercial fishers in South Gaspé, Quebec, who have a long history of fishing and have been greatly affected by this closing. 5 of them are even more affected by this closing with less than 48 hours notice because of their age. My members have been fish for mackerel by hand or with electric systems of lines and hooks, a maximum of 200 hooks. It's therefore a very selective, sustainable, and environmentally respectful fishing method. Our logbook has been, or we are required to keep a logbook by DFO, and this is only for fishers from Quebec and net fishers. Despite our arguments at the annual advisory committee in Halifax, we have where we asked for the same quick, easy controls set out in other provinces to provide our very important data. But our questions, our requests have not been granted since we have been very forthcoming for years, and considering that we've done everything we can to preserve the resource, so we are asking today that we receive emergency financial compensation for our costs before the suspension of the fishery and for loss of revenue as a result of this lost fishing season. And we want to be involved in discussions and meetings in the future concerning mackerel. We want to facilitate access to other abundant species, lucrative species, in order to see through this crisis and without requesting assistance or public funds in coming years, and sentinel and scientific fisheries for the coming years, and exploratory fisheries for other emerging species in order to diversify our portfolio for permits and helping us maintain our business while reducing pressure on species that have to be restocked. Two distinct quotas between hook fishers and net fishers in the Atlantic when the stocks are reestablished. I will finish by saying to you that our group are not against or don't question the science. We believe in the work of the scientists, and we want to reestablish this resource with selective and sustainable fishing for the future. Our group from South Gaspé deserves support and help from the government. Thank you. Thank you. Hello, Chair, members of the committee. Since I only have a couple of minutes to tell you about my 8 months of frustration, I'll go straight to the point. On 30 March 2022, this is a day that will always be a sad one for me. And for these reasons, with less than 48 hours of notice, supposedly because it was urgent to act to regenerate stocks, mackerel and herring fishing were suspended in the spring. Myself and 20 other of my comrades suddenly were without revenue and without work. Chair, that kind of a decision really hurts. Months of work, months of preparation, as well as tens of thousands of dollars invested in our boats, all of that for nothing. That's where the worst started, because what really hurt us, it's to learn that there is no compensation program for us. We were left to fend for ourselves. Understand me, I do not question the decision to suspend fishing in order to rebuild the stocks. And I certainly don't question the work and the analyses of the scientists. They do their work and I respect them. But what I do question is the way the federal government went about announcing this suspension when our boats were already in the water. We are a G7 country, a country that is supposed to provide a social fabric that leaves no one behind. Why do we have to be here before you in Ottawa 8 months after the suspension to explain you how much this sudden decision pulled the rug out from under us? Why is there nothing for support for us during the suspension? We haven't had anything to help us. What we are requesting, in addition to financial compensation, is predictable fishing, leaving an entire committee in uncertainty for more than 8 months. That's inhuman. I ask you to share these concerns with your caucuses. Thank you for listening.
Round of questions, and we'll go to Mr. Small first for 6 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a question for Mr. Sullivan. Based on this summer's experience on all coasts of the island of Newfoundland and up the shoreline in Labrador, what have your members witnessed in terms of abundance of mackerel? And are you aware of any bycatch that may have happened?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So, and it's been really overwhelming the amount of observations that have been confirmed on mackerel. It's, people have been fishing for 40, 50 years, have never seen anything like it. And I'll just kind of preface this with people who are not mackerel harvesters themselves, so it's not a self-fulfilling, promoting. It's just like we've never seen mackerel before like this, and it's broadly distributed, broad size distributions. So at the same time, it's off the coast of Labrador and down off the northeast coast of Newfoundland, in the bays, in the south, the southwest coast. So it's everywhere at the same time. Never seen certainly before, and clearly indicates that there is a disconnect between what science is showing. And you asked about the bycatch. I should say that, catching these mackerel in fisheries that are designed to catch fish, codfish that are like 7-pound codfish just coming up, this is a regular occurrence that people are passing along and getting samples from. It's really abnormal, and it's something that people have never seen before.
So this is something that's kind of abnormal too. This is a picture that was sent to me from one of your members in Notre Dame Bay, about 600 miles from the coast of Nova Scotia and in the Gulf. Where should a mackerel of that size be in August?
Well, I don't claim to be the mackerel scientist or involved in that too much, but the point is that mackerel wouldn't have been born in the Gulf, for example. It's coming from the northeast coast, wouldn't swim very far, mackerel of that size. And we're seeing more and more of that, massive amounts of what you call those pencil mackerel that were born somewhere in Newfoundland waters off the east coast somewhere, and not in the southern Gulf. And so that's why we're saying that we need to do more science to really get the true picture of what's happening with this stock.
So have you impressed upon DFO the need to engage harvesters in a more meaningful way because of accounts that I just showed you right there with anomalies and things that have never been seen before? Is DFO acknowledging that macro migrations can be changing, or are they in denial about that?
Well, it's hard to be as black and white about it, but it's been frustrating, and it's just not this year. So, like I said, we've been a decade pointing out the big disconnect, things that are not matching up with the observations. And so far, there has not been a lot done. There was one study done far north off of White Bay and Green Bay, but that was probably too cold of water. And I think Dr. Robert mentioned that. So there was one piece of work. But I mean, you don't, when you're talking about throwing people out of work, and their livelihoods and not able to make any money. I mean, I've never seen what I think is really shirking responsibility that they have to people, and that's why it's so upsetting. And I guess if I come across as angry about the lack of acknowledgement of the information from harvesters during this conversation, I guess is because I am, quite frankly, really upsetting that we're not doing more work to demonstrate what's going on with this fish stock.
So you referenced fisherman Keith Bath, who caught mackerel on the St. Pierre banks in May or June, when they should have been closer to the coasts of Nova Scotia and PEI, I guess, where they should be spawning. What kind of distance are we talking about from where the egg survey normally is taking place to where those mackerel possibly could be spawning?
Yeah, I mean, obviously that's hundreds and hundreds of miles away. It's quite the distance from where you'd expect them to be spawning. And the thing about it is we're seeing more of them. And this was an example of a bycatch in a fishery where you wouldn't see mackerel. So you're hauling nets for a bit larger groundfish species. So the amount of them there were substantial as well. So this is what really needs to be investigated further. And we've been talking about this for some time, and collecting these samples, repeatedly sending them to DFO, offering proposals to do microchemistry to demonstrate where the mackerel have spent their lives. But still, rather than do that, it seems the decision was made just to throw people out of work and shut things down. So that's why it's disappointing.
Thank you, Mr. Small. Your 6 minutes are up exactly, sir. We'll now go to Mr. Cormier for 6 minutes or less.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you very much, Chair. My questions for Mr. Collin Lelièvre. I welcome you to Ottawa. And you were talking about the fishermen. My father was a fisherman, and I know very well the challenges that you are living with. Are you both fishermen who depend completely on mackerel or herring, or do you fish others? We have a small quota for crab, 12,000 pounds, and we moved towards mackerel. We had a request for January, March. 30 March, I signed my permit. That was when they closed the fishing, and this is why now we are just fishing mackerel. And if I had had more notice, I might have been able to move to some other fish. Yes, I sold the permit the same day that the fishing was closed. I've been fishing for lobster, but before that I was doing only mackerel. The members that I represent, that I'm come to defend and ask for compensation, these are mackerel fishers. And just for clarity, myself and I think my colleagues that we have been requesting some kind of compensation for fishers who are dependent completely on this fishery, and they need assistance. And I think, as you said, that it's really, really sad that this decision was so quick, and that there is no appropriate support for you. You talked about scientific fishing, and you talked about, I mean, there are fishers in my region who have been affected by this decision. And what types of fishing, experimental fishing, or others with regard to mackerel and herring, or and for the fishers affected by this decision. Yes, I mean, we have to have information, and if we can't go out on the water to fish or do sentinel or fishing, how are they going to get any data? So this is a way to get data. We have the equipment, and so this would be something that we could do to help the government. When you talked about earlier, you said you have 5 that were more affected because of their age. Were these fishers who, young people who were just started? No, it's 64 and older. We also have young people who have spent a lot of money because they believed in buying. They had to buy our electric machines for the fishing, and they had to have a permit that only allows them to fish for mackerel, and I can. I could, in the past, go and fish for 150,000 pounds per season. Either one of you, what kind of compensation would you like to see? What kind of program, as we talked about with regard to restoring the stock? And well, for now, for what's already happened, I mean, we can't change what has already happened. We want financial support and costs for the dock fees, and you know that there are a lot of costs that we have before even putting our boats in the water, and even when the boat is out of the water, there are rental rates for our where we keep our boats, and so these are the kinds of costs we were thinking of. Thank you very much. And another witness.
Looking at some decision in the past that was made in some fisheries decisions, do you think that every time that there's a decision made by DFO that it's always let's say a last minute decision that is presented to fishers? Like it seems like most of the time we arrive at the last minute and say, well, this is going to happen at like 48 hours of notice. Do you think that it happened a lot or not a lot, or how do you see that?
Was that put out to others? I wasn't clear.
To you,
to me.
Mr.
Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, we see that quite a bit, and people, got to be able to plan for their seasons, invest, have some level of certainty. So yeah, far too often, and we've talked about it with a lot of our fisheries, like crab right on the eve, a big fishery for a lot of people. On shrimp, we're into the season. The season has already begun before decision, so essentially people are delayed. So it definitely does. It does happen far too often. And I mean, just a decision like this to close a fishery without any notice is, I think clearly you see that as unfair to people.
Thank you, Mr. Cormier. Your time is up. We'll now go to Madame Debienne for 6 minutes or less, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'm going to speak to Mr. Collin and Mr. Lelièvre. I'm very struck, and the series of decisions that included many types of fish, and I understand that your type of fishing is a very different type of fishing with lines and hooks, and so it's a very sustainable type of fishing. And it took me 7 meetings with DFO that this type of fishing is very different, and I'd like to hear you about the distinct nature of your type of fishing and why. Is it basically you? Why do you provide data to the government? Well, for a number of years that we provide data, and it's only the Quebec fishers. We have a logbook to keep, and then we they provide these figures to a company, so we have to declare what our catch is, and we have to fill in our logbook before arriving at the dock. And there are also, and as far as you know, it's just you that do this. Well, we have about 20 fishers from the Baie de Chaleur and also the net fishers. And so we, in Halifax, said try and we can, why not you have a simple system that could be used where others will have to declare their catches before they arrive at the dock. And this will be an excellent source of information from DFO, and DFO has never imposed it on other groups. And so all the data that DFO uses concerning these the stocks, it's basically the fishers in the Baie de Chaleur that use line and hook fishing, and there are also figures on catches at the dock, but there's nothing about data from other catches and other fisheries. And we keep talking about it, but nothing is ever done. And Mr. Collin and Mr. Lelièvre, you did have a meeting with the MP from Gaspé. How did that go? What impression did you have from this meeting? It was a meeting that was a bit vague. Ms. Boutillier said that we're not going to give you anything. You won't have any assistance, and try and go somewhere else and find work elsewhere. That was more or less the answer from Ms. Boutillier. And I've been fishing for 47 years, I said. But and how can you explain that they were allowing for permits for mackerel fishing? And how can you encourage young people? There are young people who are buying permits for mackerel fishing, but only a little bit later, the season was closed, and you lost your. You could have gone to. You sold your crab fishing permit. It's hard to explain it. I mean, we didn't learn about the closure until 48 hours before, and with the meeting of our group, and there were there was no guarantee that in the past that mackerel would stay open, but and when we see these young people who come to buy a permit and I assisted him, and there was a fisher who ended up with no more permit for crab because he'd sold it, and then he was only allowed 80,000 less pounds of mackerel, and I find very disappointed that this situation has been solved. And do you have any hope for some kind of financial compensation and to be able to return to fishing? And do you think that this will be better, or this will happen in 2023? Well, I think our members, we've also always worked with DFO, and we've always provided data. We'd like to be treated with more respect, and that our concerns be listened to, but we'll see what happens with experimental scientific sentinel fishing to provide a revenue for our members and to see what happens. And if in 5 years the fishing reopens, that'll be very good. But in the meantime, our members could lose their businesses. They might be able to work and fish crab in between, but and with scientific and other fishing and with other species, we might be able to find a new emerging species, good quality, and this could this will give us some options vis-a-vis mackerel. Thank you very much for being here with us.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here. Et bien sûr, merci beaucoup à les pêcheurs pour.
Thank you very much to the fishers for being here with us, for having come to speak with us, and for taking time to describe their own experience. It's very important for us to hear that.
Question is for Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan, in the newest fall edition of your FFAW magazine, there was an article written by Dr. Erin Carruthers. Now, I apologize if I'm not pronouncing her last name accurately, but you'd mentioned the importance of expanding mackerel science, and I just want to quote something that I believe it's a she, I apologize if I'm not sure, she said that long-term commitment to document the abundance, distribution, extent, timing, and age of mackerel in Newfoundland waters is needed. Until we bring more observations and data from Newfoundland into the mackerel stock assessment, I do not see how we can reconcile these widely different assessments of the health of the mackerel stocks. I'm wondering if this is also your stance, and if you can share a little bit around how DFO can best support fish harvesters to participate in the research necessary.
Yeah, and Erin Carruthers, Dr. Carruthers, still getting feedback here. Okay. So yeah, Dr. Carruthers is a scientist with the FFAW, works very closely with harvesters, and I think the quote was very accurate. I don't know if I could have found a better way to say it myself. So I think it's very, very clear and well put. And I think I think the science is incomplete, not necessarily wrong. And I just want to interject that I have respect for the scientists who do the work. And, I don't mean to be really critical of their work. We just need kind of more. I think it's kind of like thinking about, you're doing a woodland caribou survey around a 5-mile radius around the Eaton Centre there in Dundas Square. You do the work, you don't find caribou. There's nothing wrong with the methods. It's just that we got to look somewhere else as well if we're going to get the population of the caribou. So I think that's kind of the case. I'm oversimplifying, of course, but trying to point out that we're not looking at where the actual fish are. And I think we really owe it to people who depend on this to understand our resource and ecosystem better, to expand where we're doing work, particularly when we see water temperatures change. Obviously climate change documented. There's all kinds of reasons, but none better than just a vast abundance of mackerel that harvesters have seen and in many ways documented. And we'll present more to DFO when we compile all the information. So talk to harvesters, look at the methods that they do, that they can use, including acoustic work, which can be done now and I believe is done in certainly other jurisdictions in the world.
Thank you, Mr. Sullivan. I have another question for you. Can you share what reasoning or data that DFO has provided for allowing the recreational mackerel fishery in Newfoundland and Labrador, as well as the commercial U.S. mackerel fishery, to continue into 2022? If you can build on some of the ways you've touched on this.
Yeah, so two real concerns and irritants. It is a transboundary stock. The mackerel are, same stock they're catching in the US and Canada. Canada has traditionally harvested and depended upon this stock much more. I'd say more of the stock resides in the area. But now, because of Canadian management, the harvesters in the US have building up a history of catching more. I think just from a long-term perspective, that's problematic. And if the stock is, if we really believe that the stock is in that much trouble, then obviously we have to work with the US to stop their fishery, you would think. So that's disappointing from a Canadian perspective. And the fact that we just closed the fisheries, like I said, we threw people out of work, people who depended on this mackerel, and in many areas of Newfoundland and Labrador, that was the case. And obviously the counterparts we heard from here today, they don't have an opportunity fish, and though people can go out and recreationally harvest, I understand that's important, but still putting recreational needs ahead of people who are depending on it for their livelihoods, I really believe that is not the right priority listing for giving the resource to people. That has to be revisited. And in Newfoundland and Labrador, harvesters collect scientific information, much like those in Quebec with logs. Every mackerel that comes in is documented and fully weighed off and contributes to the science. And people who have the privilege to recreationally fish have no requirements to do that, which is also a problem.
Thank you. I know we've had you here for a few other studies, so it's always nice to see you here. And I know we have talked about alternative bait in previous studies, just briefly. I believe it's come up, and I don't recall if we've gotten your perspective on it. What's your thoughts on the use of alternative bait? Are you seeing it being used? Are you seeing it? What's the success with it? Just some of your thoughts around that.
No, people are for all kinds of reasons interested in looking at different bait options. So I don't think it's widely used. I think people generally like traditional baits that they can trust and source themselves. But I think there's opportunities for having less impact on some of our fish stocks. So I think it's good to explore. I think the other thing, just straight up for fish harvesters, is the increasing cost of some of our bait. So trying to find alternatives, I think, can solve a lot of problems for people. So I think there's more interest now than ever in exploring that alternative new innovative bait.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Barron. We'll now go to Mr. Perkins for 5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you again, witnesses, for attending. Mr. Sullivan, there's a scientific study or paper on DFO's website that says that mackerel spawn between 9 and 12 degrees. Earlier today, we heard testimony from one of the DFO scientists that they will do the spawning mice bioscience in water in 8 degrees, even 6 degrees, and even up to 14 degrees, which is outside of the spawning biomass time. So I understand that and it's all done at the same location in the Gulf. So I wonder if you could comment on that issue about doing science when the spawning biomass is actually not in the water temperature that's ideal for spawning.
And also that's absolutely a concern. And, we've seen in the past when we went out to do that survey, we all know that a date on the calendar doesn't tell mackerel when to spawn. It's the environmental conditions, and that can change. And I understand that, it's difficult kind of to manage, but there have been concerns expressed that not surveying when the mackerel are most likely to be spawning, and that's been highlighted. And that's one issue, I think, one gap in science that we should look to expand upon, do more, make sure that doesn't happen. And I think, as I pointed out before, we really got to look at where more of these mackerel are spawning to get a complete picture that I think would eventually explain just a massive abundance of mackerel that we're seeing off of Newfoundland and Labrador as well. So I think there's a combination of things to improve the science.
Since they go to the same place every year and have been for 10, 20 years, it's part of their scientific study, but the temperatures and the mackerel are moving, and they no longer have catch data, which was about half of their science. How are they going to tell where the mackerel are without any catch data when in the U.S. they're still catching mackerel?
Well, I'm not sure. We've offered a lot of suggestions, and so far I don't think we've been listened to very much. But I think I think it is important to probably work with harvesters in the regions to get more information on what the makeup of the mackerel stock has been. The DFO put out a call to get samples this year, and I think they were probably surprised by just how many samples they did get, and they were just very easy to catch, obviously, and just ran out of freezer space to collect those samples. So I don't know if they're prepared to do that, but they're going to have to do at the very least something that is more robust, more dependable, more organized, and invest in it rather than just depend on the goodwill of people to collect these samples. So it needs an investment, and it needs to work with fish harvesters in all regions to bulk up this science.
A couple of quick questions because my time's short. I think I've got about a minute and a half. DFO officials have said that they can't use acoustic sounding to explore and find the size of mackerel because they don't have bladders. Are fishermen able to find mackerel using acoustic sounding?
Absolutely, and that's how they catch. I mean, they're just not going out in the water setting nets where on random thoughts. So they can actually judge on biomass. And part of the work that fishermen have done, FFAW done this year, is to do that and demonstrate that. And we'd hope to have that worked up real soon. And the timeline here was quick, but I think something can be done. Short answer is yes. I think we can do that.
On the U.S. side of things, the U.S. is still fishing the mackerel commercially, and I tell you, from Peggy's Cove to Prospect in my riding where the mackerel fishermen are, the big mackerel, they're finding lots of mackerel out there. They're not allowed to catch them now because they're lobster fishermen, but the U.S. is still catching, and they set their tack usually making an assumption about what Canada's tack is. If Canada ends fishing like they did this year, do you expect the U.S. to catch actually more mackerel next year and set a higher tack?
I would not be surprised. I mean, the combination of things, I think the observations show that there is a significant amount of mackerel. I don't know if they'll see it in the U.S. or it's more north, but I wouldn't be surprised if they took advantage of the lack of harvest here.
Thank you, Mr. Perkins. Right on the mark. We'll now go to Mr. Hardy for 5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Now, as a West Coaster, I might ask a few dumb questions, okay? But bear with me. In our past studies of Atlantic cod, one of the things that has been noticed is the size of fish, that the big cod are not there anymore. Mr. McDougall, I think I heard you say that you had not been seeing large fish. Is that correct, sir? You're on mute, sir.
Yes, that's correct. We've seen a decrease in our area. What we're seeing now is similar schools, but it's a pencil mackerel that we're seeing in this area, and not having the big mackerel coming through in the abundance we had before.
And the scientists will say that you need the big fish to really help sustain the stock. Mr. Collin and Monsieur Lefebvre, have you noticed the same, a lack of larger mackerel?
Personally, I was lucky enough to do scientific fishing once a week. I had the right to take 300 kilos, and after, and they were measured, and we could hardly find 4 or 5 of 26 centimeters or less, and the others, there were some that were 38 centimeters, but not in large quantities. But with half of my my equipment, I could take about 300 kilos in about 5 minutes, and I didn't have to go very far.
I have one more question here while I have the time, but you're saying that there is a presence of larger fish. You'll say that? Yes? Okay. Now, the scientists are saying that the mackerel stocks have been in decline for decades. And I would like to have asked this question of them, but perhaps you will all be able to speculate. Do you think that this decline is somehow connected in time with the reduction in the harvest of pinnipeds? Mr. Sullivan?
Okay. I'm not offhand the relationship to pinnipeds and mackerel. I'll first off say that, I don't have clear kind of science on that. Mackerel swim relatively fast. But I do know there's more grey seals in the Gulf. There's a massive population of seals off the northeast coast of Newfoundland and Labrador, and obviously they are feeding very heavily. So, it may have something certainly to do with it. So I think that's an area that got to be explored certainly more. Absolutely.
Well, I'll stick with you, Mr. Sullivan. In a nutshell, there's obviously a clear difference between what you're seeing and what the scientists are telling us. How do we square that? How do we actually, pull it together? Just encapsulate that for us.
Yeah, and I absolutely recognize that, and I think everyone should probably review Dr. Carruthers' article that's available online on our union forum in more details, and we can send more information. But is to expand the surveys and the science that we're doing. I believe we can look at the biomass with acoustic surveys, but we're certainly willing to sit down with harvesters and explore how we measure this stock accurately, because it's become clear this year that there is a major disconnect. Harvesters are seeing, like everybody's seeing who's on the water, way more mackerel than we have in the past. And, I find it disappointing that before the cod moratorium, harvesters were talking about the declines and were dismissed. We don't seem to have learned much, and they don't get the respect certainly deserve. And this one has been particularly frustrating for people on mackerel.
Thank you, Mr. Hardy. That kind of closes out our second panel for today. I want to say a big thank you, of course, to Monsieur Leveve and Monsieur Collin and Mr. McDougall, and as well Mr. Sullivan, of course, has been here that often lately. He could probably have his own access card to get in the room. So again, thank you to all four of you for sharing your knowledge with the committee members today. I'm sure it'll help in writing a report on this very important issue. So again, just for the information of committee members, I'd like to remind them that there won't be any committee meetings next week. It is constituency week, and if you show up, you're going to be lonely. When we reconvene on Tuesday, November 15th, we will finish up the closure of the mackerel fishing study. So again, enjoy your constituency week, and we'll see you all back here on the 15th. And as well, try and be on time for the meetings when they start, because it cuts into our time. If we're late starting, we still have a drop dead time for ending, so we don't get as many questions in as we would like if we don't start the committee meeting on time. So again, enjoy your week. Meeting adjourned.
Thanks, everybody.